Welcome.
Hello.
You guys are all mic'd up? Ready to go?
Ready to
I
go.
hope so.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you guys following up. Wow, what a panel.
Great panel.
Yeah. And two guys who clearly know what they're talking about. And I thought the comment at the end there was really interesting about how this will cause Part D to operate. It's a very successful program. This morning we talked about 90% success rate or 90% satisfaction rate. Premiums less this year than when we originally started in 2006. Very high access to generics, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't in a bubble. It's an ecosystem. So do you think IRA screws up Part D?
We're certainly worried about the impact of IRA on Part D, and I was glad to hear the last panel raise it because, as you mentioned, Joel, Part D has been a phenomenally successful program, a program that came in well under CBO projections in terms of budget, high satisfaction rate, lots of consumer access and choice. But the changes that were made, including shifting a lot more risk to the plans, I think inevitably leads to plans imposing stricter utilization management, prior authorization, step therapy. I think we will end up with narrower formularies. I think there's an open question as to what happens once a drug in a given class gets their price set. So the plan is required to cover 2 drugs in a therapeutic class. Often today, plans will cover multiple products in a therapeutic class. I don't think that goes going forward. I think once a drug gets its price set, I think we will see many plans shift to just 2 drugs in a class. The question will then be, there's no obligation, by the way, under the law that once you get your price set, what tier of the formulary you're on. It could very well be that a plan says, well, I'm going to go around to all the manufacturers in this class that didn't get their price set, and I'm going to try and drive really large rebates from them and put them on a preferred tier. Who knows? But I think there's a lot of what I would believe will be unintended consequences of this law. And one that worries me a lot is the future of what Part D looks like, because I think we would all agree 20 years since passage, tinkering needed to be done. We absolutely have supported an out-of-pocket cap for seniors. We've absolutely supported the ability of seniors to spread their costs over the years so nobody's leaving a prescription at the pharmacy counter when they can't afford it. But we absolutely also support a program where patients have choice, where they have access, and where they can get the medicines they need. And I worry about the future of what Part D looks like, not because anyone that wrote this law intended that to be the case, but because I think once you put all the pieces together, there could be some real unintended consequences for patients.
And I've realized that I have failed in my key role as a moderator. and if you don't know, again, bios are in your packets, but Lori Riley, Chief Operating Officer of Pharma. Ben Schaberman is the Vice President of Science Communication at the Foundation for Fighting Blindness. And Dr. Blaise Polite, who's the Chief Physician at the University of Chicago Medicine. And we're very active in the ASCO organization. So really, thank you for being here. Sorry. Do you share some of those concerns? And the other thing that I was struck by was, you know, this, what we see in some of these SEC calls with investors and the announcement from Lilly, from 2 companies, one on a cancer product, one on a vision product, right? What are you hearing from your members? Are you concerned about this?
So we do have concern. Just to give you a little background, the Foundation Fighting Blindness, who I work for, we are a nonprofit. We fund research for a broad spectrum of rare inherited retinal diseases. Collectively, they affect about 200,000 people in the US. And ultimately, we want to drive innovation. We're funding some really cutting edge research, gene therapies, small molecules, cell-based therapies, some really cutting edge approaches. And of course, we want to provide access to these treatments once they cross the finish line to our patients and families who are affected. The challenge is we need companies, especially smaller companies who are working in labs, to move these treatments into clinical trials, we need them to have incentives to enter the marketplace and take the risk of developing one of these cutting-edge treatments. And you heard in the previous panel a lot about the Medicare exemption, pricing exemption, and how when you move to a second indication, you lose that exemption. And so one of the diseases that we fund research for is called Stargardt disease, and it causes devastating central vision loss. It's diagnosed in kids, usually, or young adults, and it causes a blind spot that grows, or patches that grow over time. And once people get to be usually our age, they're legally blind, and they can't recognize faces, they can't read, they can't drive. It's really debilitating. Well, one of our partners called Alnylam has an FDA-approved drug for, it's called ATTR polyneuropathy, and that's a condition I know nothing about. But it's FDA approved, and they were going to move it into a phase 3 clinical trial for Stargardt disease, which we were really excited about because, as I think everybody knows, that's the last stage of a clinical trial. So it's a really good point in the development process. But because of the loss of the Medicare exemption, because it's a second rare indication, they decided to focus on a treatment that's at a much earlier stage in the development process. It's not even in humans yet. So that greatly delays the potential access for the treatment. You know, at the end of the day, we appreciate the intent, I think, of the IRA, and I will admit there are a lot of nuances that are difficult to understand and a lot to still be determined. But ultimately, we need to drive innovation to get treatments out to people who need them.
So let me throw something at you, because we're tracking all these calls, and we're you can't lie to the SEC. Bad things happen to you if you're a company and you lie to the SEC, right? So when we raise some of these issues with, like, Liz Fowler, who was here today, and some members of Congress, they say, oh, well, that's just a smokescreen, because we're only 5 months after the law was signed. And companies, 4 to 6 years before price controls take effect. So how in the world could these companies be making these kinds of decisions? Like, isn't this just a, smokescreen?
I won't venture to guess if it's a smokescreen or not, but I think the uncertainty, logically you would think, would cause hesitation. I don't want to speak for Alnylam. They've come out and talked about this particular drug in this particular situation. But in my short time trying to learn about the act, there's clearly a lot to be determined and a lot of fuzziness, not to get overly technical, but about what it could mean to a drug developer.
Can you explain why you care? Why did you get into the blindness
Sure.
space and talk about
Well, fortunately, I didn't get in because I'm personally affected by a retinal disease, but I talk to people every day who are losing or have lost a lot of vision. And going blind has got to be one of the most challenging things that can happen to somebody, especially if you're parents who have a child that's born with a significant vision loss. That can be really, really challenging. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're older, you got a lot going on and you lose your vision, you lose your independence. So this is a really critical need. And I've had the privilege and I guess the awareness raising of being in contact with people on a regular basis who are really in need of treatments and cures. In our mission is the word urgent, because we recognize that people need treatments and cures now.
So was this a body blow?
I don't know that I would call it that. This is one particular case. I think we're still learning. But I think it's raising awareness for us of what the implications of the IRA might be. Or at least in this case, this is a definite implication, but we're still learning.
So, Dr. Polite, you are a provocative person.
Well, you haven't even heard me speak yet, but that's going to be true.
So I want to ask you a provocative question.
Sure.
Avalier put out some research recently. They're a firm here in DC, and they do economics and other research. They said that because Medicare pays for drugs administered by physicians, they looked at the drugs and the potential impact, and they said about 50% reduction as a result of the IRA. And yet, I recall when we were going through the IRA debate, the physician groups were largely silent about the IRA itself. Is there enough interest in the physician community right now around the IRA to say, wait a minute, there's a good thing, there's a bad thing, or we need to rethink how we think about reimbursing drugs that are physician administered?
So the answer to that is many of the physician groups, so I represent, as part of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, I'm a practicing oncologist, have recognized that the current buy and bill system is a broken system. We understand it's a broken system. We have put forward and put in front of the committee that was established for the Innovation Center proposals where you can actually pay us based on value. But I think it's important in this debate to back up on a couple things. So I'll make a few observations for someone who's been in this space for 30 years. One, the pricing system in drugs, and especially in specialty drugs, is a broken system, all right? There is very little relationship between price and value. We know that. Anybody who's looked at any data will tell you that, the launch price of a drug and what it's doing in terms of survival, et cetera, there essentially is no correlation, and that's a problem. Number two, price does impact, we can talk about rebates, price does impact the patients that I see every day, right? So, there are people who are skipping drugs, not filling prescriptions, not able to get it because of the price of drugs. So we always have to remember when we hear about, drugs that, may not be approved and all that there are current people who should be benefiting from drugs who are not. The third thing then I would say is we as oncologists, look, our world is drugs. So, contrary to what was said in a previous panel, if you look, for example, in the oncology care market and the oncology care model, drugs make up, of the total cost of care for us, drugs make up now 60 to 65% of the cost of providing care to a Medicare patient. And so it is all about drugs to us. But there are value-based solutions out there that are market-based, that we've put forward and others have put forward that I think the IRA ignores. What I'm very, very concerned about, and again, as someone who's actually developed value and value sort of pricing models, putting this in charge, giving it under the secretary with, if you look at the legislation, and Lord knows I've read it 47 times over, trying to understand how they're actually going to determine what should be the value-price relationship. And there's no transparency there. And I'll tell you, it gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. But I think there are ways we can get at that. We can talk about value-based pathways and other things. So I think there are market-based solutions to this. But I do at least credit the fact that we have a system, from our perspective, that's broken. And it does need a solution. So we can throw rocks at a solution that I fully agree has all sorts of concerns and potential unintended consequences if it ends up sort of being okay at all. But we can't stop there and say, but the current system basically is okay, because it's not okay, folks. It's really not okay.
Yeah. And you've had some experience designing value-based care models, and there's a number of different ones to pick from, but like we've got the OCM oncology care model, now transitioning to the enhancing oncology model. But drugs, like you said, are fairly core to oncology.
Correct.
So how do we recognize that value? What is the right way to say we are going to incentivize the use of higher value outcomes?
So one of the things that's been an innovation, and that many of us in our organization and many of the have got on board with, are we call care pathways, right? And there are private companies out there that have representation, from physicians, from patient advocates, and we sit down and say, okay, what should be my first-line drug for metastatic colon cancer? What are the criteria? We look at the data, and then you look at the pricing, and you say, okay, this should be your first choice, and here are sort of alternative choices. And then what you do is you turn our decision-making, right, our utilization of a value-based pathway into a high-stakes quality metric. You say, look, if you want to get shared savings, or if you want to get the management fee, you have to, be on pathway 80% of the time, 75% of the time. I mean, these are math we can sort of discuss. But essentially what it says is allow us as a group, and I would invite pharma to that group, because I've always said, look, if you put us all in a room for a weekend and said, we're not opening these doors until you guys come to an agreement on how we determine value. And if you don't come to an agreement, the secretaries to negotiate. I think we would not only have the solution, but would have time for bourbon and a few other things, which I'm looking forward to, sort of after that. So I think we could come to an agreement of value, but you can't have it imposed on us, and you have to have us all at the table. But if you did that, then I think we are more than willing to recognize that there are some drugs that, although approved by the FDA, are probably not worth the price that they're at, and that there are alternatives who will not bankrupt the system or the patient, or us, and still achieve adequate outcomes. So that's sort of our my perspective, and I think ASCO's perspective for the most part.
That's actually how we ended up with the Part D program. They locked us in a basement room.
Yeah.
For 17 weeks.
I've offered to show up in the room.
Lori, so Ryan and Connor mentioned it a little bit, this challenge that we're seeing, the nuanced investment decisions that we're starting to see come out of these calls. Talk to us about the 9 to 13 issue, because I'm not sure all was clear for everyone, at least not to me, exactly where they were heading. And what does industry think about that, and how do you think about Congress or the administration needs to address that?
Thanks for the question. I think, the unfortunate reality of this law is that it very arbitrarily treats small molecule medicines very differently than it treats ones that may be infused or injected in a physician office. And the reality is small molecule medicines, which have been around for a very long time, in fact, 80% of all prescriptions are small molecule. There's advantages oftentimes. They pick them up at the pharmacy. They can, be used to treat they can cross the blood-brain barrier for one, they can penetrate cell membranes, so there's advantages for many patients and for many conditions to use these. But now under the law, what it essentially says is after 9 years, the government can come in and start setting the prices for these medicines. Now, there's an awful lot of, for example, oncology medicines that happen to be small molecule. About 60% of small molecule oncology medicines have additional indications that a company has started studying 7 years past initial approval, which is often what happens. You get an initial approval in one indication. Over time, physicians may use that to treat other types of cancer. And so companies go back, they do the clinical research to get that indication. This, I think, puts that in significant jeopardy, because a company has to evaluate, am I going to start a clinical trial knowing that in a year the price of my medicine is likely to be set? And so we did a survey of our companies to see, what do you think the impact will be? 63% of them said that they will develop fewer small molecule medicines. So already we're going to see a shift, I think, to more biologic medicines. 90+% said that they will rethink additional uses for given medicines. So it will have an impact. We would like to see, obviously, that number go up to 13 years. We don't think that there should be this arbitrary distinction made between biologic medicines and small molecule medicines. We absolutely cannot retrench on 13 years either, and I've heard some opine on that. Quite honestly, one could argue whether 13 years is sufficient, but at least for purposes of today, I would argue that definitely we need to move 9 to 13 and treat these medicines as they are the same, because from a patient perspective, you don't really care when you get sick, quite honestly. You want a medicine that's going to be available to treat your disease, and I worry about rare diseases. I worry about cancer medicines. I worry about cardiovascular and mental health, neurology. A lot of the new Alzheimer's medicines, these are small molecule medicines. We need more of them. We need to encourage research in these areas. And this bill is setting a clear disincentive to do that. And if you're a company, you respond to incentives, positive and negative. When Part D passed, we saw a significant uptick in research for medicines that treat seniors. Not surprisingly, we now had a benefit that provided access to prescription medicines for the first time ever, and you saw an increase. We now have a disincentive that's been put in the law. And conversely, I think we're going to see the repercussions of that in fewer types of research into new medicines, as well as new uses for existing medicines.
Yeah. Ben, there was a bit of discussion about that secondary indication issue. I'm not even sure your organization works with Congress, but if Congress were to fix that, I suspect you would see some results from that.
Yeah, I think an important point for everybody to understand, and a lot of you may understand this, just going back to this other repurposed drug, is that treatments often take 10, 15, 20 years to move through the development pipeline. If you can take an existing drug and move it into a phase 3 right off the bat, that's a huge advantage, both from a cost standpoint and a timing standpoint. So we as an organization are very interested in partnering with researchers, companies, whomever, that can repurpose something to move it into a later stage clinical trial. We do fund early stage research. We fund translational research to help move treatments out of labs into clinical trials. And we're sensitive to the small biotechs that are just starting out in lab research, trying to get something into a clinical trial, and they need incentives to do that. It's high risk, and they need to get a return on that investment. They need to attract investment, and they have to know they're going to get some meaningful revenue from that. So we're very sensitive to that, and it can potentially have a big impact in our world.
So, Dr. Play, I'm going to start with you and talk about some of the solutions, and it might be an Inflation Reduction Act or it might be outside. But I agree with you. I think we have a broken system, and I see that acutely in physician world, where we've got this yearly scramble to try and avoid a 2% cut or a 4% cut or a 10% cut. Reminds me of back when we were doing an SGR. And I get these trauma flashbacks, right?
We were so happy that we fixed it.
We fixed it and replaced it with a system that guarantees you'll be cut. Not might be cut. So there's this intersection of drugs and care. Not for everyone, but we also have this broken physician reimbursement system.
Sure.
So I don't want to throw rocks. I want to provide solutions.
Sure.
Where do we need to head here?
So, I think what many of us said, and I won't say this is universal across the cancer community, but we would much rather, get out of the, buy and bill system, which is the foundation of our financial, viability right now, right? There's no question about it. If you got rid of buy and bill tomorrow, oncology practices across the country would shut down, period, right? So you can't get rid of buy and bill without what is the replacement. From our standpoint, what the replacement is pay us in a value-based system for very defined sets of quality. So what we have right now in the field with 13 pilot practices is something that we call the APC4 model. But essentially what it is look, you have to have patient navigation. You have to have psychosocial services for patients. You have to have 24/7 care, alternatives to ERs, health equity. You embed all these things and say if you achieve these things, then you get a management fee, which is a real management fee, not the OCM was $165, now $75. But give us real dollars for taking care of human beings, and let the drug pricing and the drug debate sort of pull us out of that, right? So I think we could live in that world. Again, some of my colleagues will probably shoot me for saying that, but if that world actually existed, right? If you were really committed to a true value-based, and we can sort of say, these are the set of things that look like value to a patient, and you're gonna sort of take the drug money and sort of put it there, I think many of us would jump up and down and embrace that tomorrow. But we can't live in a system where, well, we're going to keep cutting the margins here. Oh, but by the way, still do all the things you need to do, take care of very, very complex, patients. And that's, and that's the trouble with sort of the debate, right now. But
So
yeah, the buy and bill system has lots of issues with it.
Is that more of a, so are you thinking more of a, like almost like a capitated type
Yeah.
arrangement? And
Yeah,
based on some quality outcomes and then you.
Right, with, again, I think a value-based system where we're at two-sided risk and are being held accountable for the things that we have control over, right? Our criticism of things like OCM and the enhanced oncology model have been that since drugs are 80% of it, I don't control drug price. I simply don't. I have no way of controlling drug price, and yet that's essentially what I'm held accountable for, right? I'm held accountable for drug price. I'm not held accountable for utilization, and it's so, it's such a large percentage that I could do everything else well. I could keep people out of ERs. I could keep people home. I could keep them at work, and it's irrelevant, right? I could achieve savings on the hospital side and still completely, end up owing a lot of money because of drug pricing. And that's our, that's been our issue sort of in that is, you're holding us accountable for things that we don't have the ability to control.
You mentioned OCM. We're transitioning to this new model, basically do more, get paid less.
Yeah.
Are your colleagues jumping up and down to participate in that model?
No. I mean, I think what you'll see, and I'm sure what they will tell you is, all these people sent applications. We put an application in because we want to see the data. But there is simply no way with a model that is predicated on drug pricing. And that's what it is, right? It is a drug pricing model. They can tell you whatever they want, look at the percentages. There is no way to make that work. And a drug pricing model, by the way, that doesn't take into account really anything about patients other than, stage of disease, but it doesn't take into account all the molecular subtypes, all the things that drive our decisions are completely irrelevant, in the models. And so we've said, that's just a silly way to do this. And it is, it's one way to get after the drug cost issue, and it's essentially saying, you guys are on the hook, figure it out. And that's not a viable solution. So I think at the end of the day, you'll see very little uptake in the EOM as currently designed. Again, a lot of applications, very few people who are going to actually sign up for it.
Ben, when I ask you, what does a better future look like? And what do we need to change here? Solutions.
Well, I feel obligated, given the mission that I work for, is just getting more treatments and cures across the finish line and out to the people who need them. And an important point, at least to our mission and the research that we fund, is, there's a cost, especially to an innovative therapy, but if you can cure blindness, if you can prevent blindness, the financial benefit to society is enormous because blindness costs our society a lot of money. Unemployment, healthcare costs, emotional costs. So I think it's important to understand that. But we want to fill the pipeline with potential treatments, get them across the finish line, and of course, at the end of the day, make them accessible to patients and families, have them be covered by insurance, have them be reasonably priced. But we also realize that the companies that develop these treatments, especially these smaller, innovative biotechs, need incentive to get into the marketplace.
Lori, same question. I was interested to hear Connor's remark. This was hyper-focused on very narrow, like the price argument on this side of the issue. So where do we need to go in IRA, outside of IRA solutions?
Great question. I think, when we think about prescription drug prices, of course, I think manufacturers tend to get 100% of the blame. The reality is, if you look at the list price of a prescription medicine, less than half, 48% goes back to the manufacturer. 52% is going to someone else in the supply chain. That's a pharmacy benefit manager, it's an insurance company, it's a hospital, it's a pharmacy, it's a wholesaler. And that doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense to most people. So we have to get to a different system where we're not just looking at the manufacturer of the medicine, but we're looking at the entire supply chain and saying, how do we ensure that we're delivering medicines to patient in the most efficient way possible without creating unintended consequences and misaligned incentives. And I think today, when you're talking about paying people based on the list price of a medicine, that creates some odd incentives. It may not encourage the use of a cheaper medicine. What it encourages is a medicine with a high list price and a high rebate. And that's not necessarily a system that I think most people want, particularly if you're a patient that has a high deductible health plan that's being asked to pay that list price every time you show up to the pharmacy counter. So we think more needs to be done to look at the entire system. How do we get at some of these misaligned incentives? How do we start saying patients should pay up based on the list price of a medicine? And oh, by the way, patients should not be paying more than their hospital acquired a medicine for or their insurance company acquired a medicine for. And that happens time and time again today.
All right, we have time for, no, we don't have time for questions. Do you have any questions? One question, right over here. Just speak up real loud.
Speak up real loud, that's not right. I want to thank you, Lori, for being the first one to bring into the conversation the notion of fail first, the notion of patient-centered care, doctor. When we'd like to see what everybody's comment is about adding the letter A as a variable in a value conversation, an equation, where A is what's appropriate that the patient and family want and need, and how that filters through the entirety of the day's discussion.
Appropriateness.
Could not agree more with your comment. And what I worry about, whether it's the IRA or the unintended consequences from the IRA, is that we're moving further and further away from that. I worry we're ending up in a system, in my mind, IRA left everything that patients hate about insurance, right? It took a sledgehammer to future innovation, to additional research on uses, but it didn't address the fundamental issue that I hear about, and I hear from my family and other people when they're dealing with insurance, which is how many hurdles am I going to have to go through to get my medicine? Do I have choice in the therapies that I want, that my physician may say is best for me? Now listen, an element of that has to exist in the system, and I would be the first to say payers have to have tools in order to be able to drive costs and negotiate. Absolutely 100% full stop. At the same time, those have to be balanced with the needs of the individual patient. And I feel like we've gotten away from that careful balance, and I believe that the IRA is going to tilt that balance even more and force payers to have to put even tighter controls on the access choices that patients have and the types of tools they will inevitably be using to hold costs down.
Others?
Well, again, going back to sort of a value-based pathway concept, their appropriateness is front and center. It's front and center in two ways, right? One, it's for the vast majority of patients, does this drug make sense, right? But the second thing is, if I am 100% on anything, right? If I am 100% on a pathway, I will tell you right now I'm practicing bad medical care. And so you need systems that do allow for me to veer off, and not penalize me. At the end of the day, my prime directive on any payment system that you all here design is, if I'm ever getting penalized for providing the right care to the right patient at the right time, you've got a broken system, right? So, the first thing I do is look at it through that lens, is, are you penalizing, me who have to sort of prescribe the care and I'm the gatekeeper of the care, am I being penalized for doing the right thing? And the second you do that, I guarantee you that's a system that will collapse.
We will let that be the last word, unless...
Just a quick comment. I live in the rare disease space, and I think that's an important space to keep in mind. Rare diseases collectively, as I think many of us know, are not that rare. But the challenge in the rare disease space is we have very few treatments and cures. So innovation is so important to get treatments again through the pipeline. So that's my perspective. I'm sensitive to price and access and all those things, but right now we just need to get treatments across the finish line.
Well put, well said. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists here. Thanks. And I realize that I am the guy standing between you and bourbon. So I'll make this real quick. I wanted to thank everyone for just being here today, for engaging this and being a part of this discussion. I took away a lot of different ideas I think that I'm encouraged at the fact that we've got a lot of people in this country covered. They have coverage, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, ACA, but most importantly, employer coverage. But we've got a cost problem, and we need to work on that. We need to work on it collectively because we've got a lot of different interests at the table. And if I gore your ox, he's happy, but you're definitely not happy. So there are solutions for this. For CHC, we've got a 4-point agenda. We want to protect and expand employer coverage. We want to incentivize and create more options for small businesses. We want to lower healthcare costs, and we want to increase competition and transparency. And we've got policy approaches and bills and stuff around all 4 of those points. We want to engage with you. We want to work together. I think the more people we can get on the same page, the more effective we can be. The more diversity of voices that we bring to the table with Congress, the better chances we have at moving the needle. So thank you to our sponsors, Pharma, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Novartis, and Better Medicare Alliance. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you guys for being here. Let's drink.